Good afternoon. Welcome to a special workshop meeting. Today is, what is today? July 26th, and it's 2 p.m. Please note, let me see, no or action may be taken at this meeting. I'd like to go around the table and introduce those that are at the table. Yes, I mentioned that action may be taken, so thank you. I am Mayor Bob Severance, and go to our left here.
Danny Pagal, Mayor Pro Tem.
Rick Ulrich, City Council.
Doug Merriman, City Administrator.
Keith Garces, the attorney.
Joel Servadius, City Council.
Beth Munn, City Council.
So thank you very much, and again, welcome. We'll start off with our action items. We've got consent items. Anybody have any discussion about those at this point? Okay, seeing none, we will move on to our development services. Did I miss something?
Nope.
We all right here?
No.
Okay.
Yep.
Action item under public hearing, development services, resolution 17-13, countywide planning policies amendment. And I'm guessing that we have Mr. Powers?
Yes.
Here, okay, our development services director coming to join us at the table. Welcome, Mr. Powers.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. As the mayor noted, this is the countywide planning policy amendment. We have scheduled it as a public hearing for your action. As you might recall, we briefed you, I think, a couple different times on this topic. We certainly had one at your last workshop. And so we know that you're fairly familiar with this. Of course, it wasn't that long ago since we adopted the version that we're currently amending. That takes me to this first slide for your benefit. Council adopted the new countywide planning policies, I believe, in February of 2016. That was the culmination of about 2.5 years worth of work between county staff, city staff, and staff from other jurisdictions. It did a number of things. Perhaps one of the more significant things from your perspective and for your understanding is that it established a new process for the buildable lands analysis that has relevance to us and significance as we talk about the capacity for our urban growth area to accommodate new growth, particularly residential growth. But as we've acknowledged at our previous briefing and again today, we knew that when you do something as significant as rewriting a body of policies like this, there were going to be things which needed to be adjusted or tweaked once we got into the actual implementation of them. And so that became apparent even probably within 6 months of their adoption in terms of how the county was seeing some of these things working from a practical perspective. And so we started informal conversations with them towards the tail end of last year. And then more formalized once the new year rolled around. And that resulted in us getting a first draft distributed to us for official comment in April of this year. We provided them back comments in May in writing as a precursor to getting formal comments from Planning Commission and City Council. And that's the last bullet point on the slide. We've been engaged in a series of briefings with both of you bodies. This was just a simple graphic that we put together previously to kind of give you a picture of where the countywide planning policies fit into the GMA scheme. Think of Growth Management Act as the overarching state law and policy that we have to meet. Then it mandates that we have countywide planning policies between cities and counties. Off to the side are interlocal agreements, which are formal tools that help us implement some of our policy agreements. Then the next tier down from that are comprehensive plans, which by state law have to be consistent with the countywide planning policies. I've put a separate box out to the side there for joint planning areas and urban growth areas because I know those are of interest to the council. And then finally, the last tier of that upside down pyramid, if you will, are development regulations, which, as you are well aware, need to be consistent with our comprehensive plan, which in turn has to be consistent with the things above it. So again, just a picture of that hierarchical structure that we're working within. And this was just a graphic that we put together for the Planning Commission's benefit to just remind them that we're not in this alone. So it does involve the county and the other jurisdictions. And so you may see some language or words in the countywide planning policies which you say, well, the city doesn't have any rural areas, we don't have any raids, we don't have any of those things. That's because, again, this document covers all of the jurisdictions to the degree that the policy would apply to that particular jurisdiction. This is the nuts and bolts of what countywide planning policies are all about. And I will use the screen behind me, maybe. Yeah. Thank you, Dennis. So to orient everybody, this is SR 20 as it comes through town. Seaplane base is generally here. Alt field base is here. So the area in the pale yellow, which is shaded back, is the area which is presently within the Oak Harbor city limits. Areas in the pale back purplish blue color are areas which are in the urban growth area, but are not yet annexed as part of the city of Oak Harbor. So as we know, most of the Oak Harbor Road corridor and portions of the Goldie Road corridor are in our UGA, but they're not inside of the city limits yet. That gives you that sense. The area outlined in the heavy black line represents our existing joint planning area, which in layman's terms is an area that both the city and the county are going to think about as we make certain kinds of planning decisions. And you saw in your countywide planning policies a definition of that that's obviously more formalized than that. The legend down here tells you that we are using some slightly different terms to designate properties inside of the joint planning area than the previous version of the countywide planning policies. We were using terms that of potential growth area in areas of long-term rural significance, i.e. areas where we would expect to grow and areas where we would not expect to grow because there is something significant about that land which says it should not be urbanized. We figured those definitions really don't work all that well, and we would be better served if our definitions were more closely aligned with things that we see in the RCW or in the Washington Administrative Code, which is why we now have the designation of priority growth areas, areas in which we would set a priority into moving into in the future as we need more capacity. And then areas which we might deem to be auxiliary growth areas that they wouldn't necessarily be last chance, but they aren't going to be first on the list either. And so this represents the existing joint planning area with the designations that we've applied through the 2016 version of the countywide planning policies and what we would expect to do with this version as well. So again, that's another picture that really summarizes all of the things that we're dealing with when we're talking about the countywide planning policies. If we were to characterize the amendments which are found in this roughly 32-page document, I think they fall into four broad categories. The first is definitions, and as I've mentioned, the effort at the county's side was to make the definitions more consistent, or at least improve their consistency with RCWs and the Washington Administrative Code. Second body of amendments falls within how we talk about the joint planning area. And as I just pointed to you on the map, we've renamed those categories. You see some refined criteria deciding how we're going to categorize or not categorize lands within the joint planning area and some policies associated with those lands. Next up in terms of the body of changes are those things for the urban growth area. Again, incorporating the new definitions. And then here's a fairly significant change, clarifying the process by which we might consider moving lands from a joint planning area into the urban growth area. And that has significance because then those are the lands that over time we would expect to annex and we would expect to see developed at an urban level of intensity as opposed to a rural level of intensity. And then finally, you see that there were some changes for the buildable lands model, primarily refinements in the assumptions which are being utilized. And the real sum goal of those refinements are to better represent real world conditions as we talk about development on the ground, or the possibility for development on the ground. Planning Commission's had a couple of different reviews of this. Last evening they conducted their public hearing and recommended approval of the revised countywide planning policies to you. Whoops. Tim, can you help me get that last slide? Thank you. And so our recommended action to you this afternoon is that you conduct your own public hearing and that you adopt a resolution number 1713, amending the countywide planning policies. Before we move on from that, as you've probably gathered through our conversations with you, this has really been a work in progress, and reflective of that, we actually have a few amendments to the resolution that we'd ask that you would consider. And this really focuses, the proposed amendments really focus more on the joint planning area itself and communicating council's interest in that topic. A couple of you have talked to me or to Dr. Merriman about joint planning area and our interest in that. And so we've taken the liberty of trying to capture that interest in a couple of additional whereas statements in your resolution. So obviously using our legislative edit format, just sort of tagging on to the end of what we had. And I think Ms. Nicole is looking for a copy. The first new whereas really is focusing on the council's desire to make sure we're providing affordable single-family housing opportunities for our citizens. And so you would be formally asking the county to consider expanding the joint planning area in areas which are logical to support new residential growth. You're giving them a general idea of where we have historically thought that was likely, which is down here to the south or southwest of the existing JPA boundaries. We think about, the constraints that we have in terms of natural features of the water or man-made features of the air station, and then, the impacts of the air station in terms of things to the east of us. Our logical growth area, as we talk about residential, is to the south and to the southwest. So that's the first whereas there. New whereas rather, and then the second new one just indicates our desire to see that land identified as priority growth area, consistent with the new language and the new policies inside of the countywide planning policies. And then a slight revision of your actual resolution portion, now therefore it be resolved, to reflect those two new whereases above it. Again, since this has been a work in progress, literally the ink dried on this at about noon today, so apologize for not getting it to you sooner, but hopefully it's a relatively simple change for you to consider. I do have a clean version, should it be approved by the council for the mayor's signature as well. So happy to help you with any questions you might have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Powers. I don't see any members of the public here, but I before the council talks about this, I would like to make sure that this is a time that we are having a public hearing. So if anybody wishes to come from the audience to speak about this, now would be your time. Okay, let's bring it back up to those in attendance here. Does anybody have any input or questions? Yes, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you very much, Mayor. I have a question that amendment, besides future planning, joint planning for, and request for additional residential development, and the city include request for additional commercial development in that area, on the south or southwest. Previously, there was, I think, request by the city to have improvement in that area, request for annexation that was turned down by the Island County, and the Island County responded to have an infill in the city for residential or commercial development.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, Mr. Pagao, and I think that the simplest answer to that is that this whereas statement would not preclude future designations of land for commercial purposes in an expanded joint planning area. What this is really saying is that right now the council, and you've been talking for the last year or two about your concerns about having enough single-family housing for the community. And this is just officially conveying or formally conveying that sentiment to the county. And all this would really do is say, we would like you to consider expanding the JPA And then there will be several steps after that in which we would talk about where that expansion might take place. And then you'd talk about, well, do we need the new capacity for actual growth? If yes, then you'd go through the process to expand the urban growth area. And at that time, you'd figure out how do you want to designate the lands inside of that from a zoning perspective. So this is sort of the first piece in many, many pieces in the puzzle. But this would not preclude that happening in the future.
That'd be good. And I have another one, just one more. On page 29, it's the joint planning area right on top, overlay designation of auxiliary growth area should be considered for the lands which is underneath that. There are 5 of them. And one of those is says within or close proximity to accident potential zones and areas highly impacted by aircraft noise identified by ACUS program, noise contour maps. Now, this auxiliary growth area, is this additional to the urban growth area, which means that there are areas within NAS Whidbey are developable areas that development can occur, and what will be protection to NAS Whidbey to prevent encroachment?
Sure. And so the main point behind the auxiliary growth area designation is to say that there is something about that land which really doesn't make it your first choice for development, and probably, frankly, not even your second or your third choice for development. And so what this is saying is that when it comes to the map, we should designate lands which are affected by these 5 things, and the one that you're focusing on is the noise zones or the crash zones. We should designate them as auxiliary growth area to make it clear that that's not where any of us think expansion makes good sense. And so you can see right here within the existing joint planning area, this swath of the county is right in line with where we know the noise zone contours are and the APZs are at. And so that's really saying this is not a good place for urban growth. And so we should stick with the rural functions, the rural land uses in that area. The same kind of principle applies, but from a different bullet point perspective. If we look at some of the properties out on the west side. Now, those aren't affected by NAS Whidbey operations, but they may have significant drainage problems and significant wetland problems or significant other sort of critical area problems. And you say those are tough to overcome in an urban development situation. So that's not our first choice for development. But specifically to your question, Mr. Begal, we are not using that designation to encourage, but rather to say this is not where we should be going.
So therefore, even though it's a possible urban growth area, under planning purposes, Island County is also legally bound to make developments, and there are certain protection
Yes.
of encroachment to NAS would be.
Yes, and I think one of the things that maybe I didn't include in my opening remarks is when we talk about the joint planning area, it does not mean that all of that land is necessarily going to become part of an urban growth area. And it doesn't even mean that we are planning it for growth. It just means that we may have some common interest in that area that we should be thinking about, whether it's from the county's perspective or the city's perspective. And so we should be aware of those areas and make sure that we talk about them from time to time. So just because something is either in an existing joint planning area or maybe in some future joint planning area does not mean that all of that land will eventually become part of the urban growth area. It's a possibility if you meet all of the different things, but it's not a guarantee, nor is it a a foregone conclusion.
Good. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, other input, questions? Okay, so our proposed recommended action is that we adopt this resolution, amending the countywide planning policies. Yes, Councilor Servadius.
Thank you, Mayor. I move to adopt Resolution 1713, amending the countywide planning policies.
Second.
Okay, we've got a motion and a second. Motion by Councilor Servadius, second by Councilor Munns, to adopt Resolution 1713, amending the countywide planning policies. Any other input? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Yes,
Um,
Councilor
could I-
Munns?
Mr. Powers, could you send us the revised and that map?
Oh, sure.
So that I have it in a packet with this packet?
Sure.
Please?
Absolutely. Be
I would
happy
appreciate
to
it.
do that.
That would help.
Make
Thank
a
you.
note so I don't forget.
Okay, item number B, under action items then, we'll go to item number B, public hearing, ordinance number 1801, amending Oak Harbor Municipal Code, Title 20, updating the City of Oak Harbor critical area regulations. This is being continued from the July 5th, 2017 City Council regular meeting. So it looks like we've got a senior planner that has joined us at the table here, Mr. Dennis Lefebvre. So,
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I think, Doug, did you want to lead off this discussion?
I wanted to start off with our conversation as the mayor just shared with us. This is a continuation of our last conversation that we were having on the critical areas ordinance. Some of the conversation that came up on that last meeting was regarding rainfall effects on low impact development. Even though this is somewhat aside from the critical areas, there was some council discussion about it is related because it does address stormwater issue. And that's a conversation we can probably continually have. But one of the things I wanted to bring back to council is staff has been doing quite a bit of work on that whole rainfall issue, and I wanted to give you a quick update on that. And I've talked a little bit before the meeting with Mr. Almberg on this. I've had some conversations with the Department of Ecology, mainly down in their Olympia office, about our theory about rain shadow effects on LID. And after talking with a couple different individuals, I was referred up to Christina McGinnis, who's someone we've worked with before from ecology on different things. You may have heard that name before. And I walked her through our thought on rain shadow alternatives on that and how we can maybe have some form of adjustment or relief on some of these standards, if that's even a possibility, and if we base that on scientific data. And Christina discussed with me an option, how an entity can find a way to modify or to tune adjustment. It's under the, I think it's Manual 5 adjustment, they call it, where you can go in and if you have a case for some local standards based on scientific data that you can prove and put in that, the city can adopt an adjustment that's a variance from the state requirements to fit your local information that you have. There are a couple of things that we would have to do to justify that. One is the city needs to do a written finding of fact that supports your scientific data you're using. And they have a term that's called providing substantially equivalent environmental protection. So basically what it is they're wanting us to look at their model and make sure we're not departing too far from that methodology. There's other things as far as sound engineering practices we have to follow. But as far as a city organization, what we would do then, according to Christina, is adopt a citywide policy that says we want to establish somewhat of our own local standard in some of these areas. So we're going to adopt this policy that says how we're going to apply this with each of our applications that come in. So what we would do then is you have a citywide policy, and then for each applicant that sends something in our development review file for that project, then we need to include the findings for that specific case and state in there how we're taking a position based on our local policy on that. So that's roughly the case. So right now, I was speaking with Joe Stoll today on this and saying, how do we start bringing that in place? Engineering has already jumped on that. They're already working with ecology on that issue to see how we can do that. Particularly right now, it's on the trenching requirement and seeing how we can get an adjustment possibly on that BNP that fits more in our rain shadow model and using that as the scientific data. There are some pieces of their model we want to see how we might replicate that, but insert our own data into that. And there's some more steps we want to see how we can start pursuing that. So that's our next steps right now, is working with ecology to determine that calculation methodology and seeing how we can overlay our own scientific data, if it's rainfall data or something, that we can use in there. And Christina actually even gave me a couple of manuals on rainfall data that might be ones that would be helpful for us to do that. So just so you know, that's an update on the process we're taking right now. I think that's been some worthwhile effort, and I think Joe and Arnie are already working forward on getting some of that put together. There are some areas we don't know yet as far as pervious surfaces and those things, but we'll take those as we can. But it was encouraging to find out that there's actually a methodology in the manual itself to try to put that adjustment in place. If you do an adjustment like that, it doesn't require ecology oversight or approval on that. But if we use the term exemption and we want to just eliminate it, that's a whole different story. But it probably wouldn't be a bad idea, even in an adjustment, to have ecology give it an eye a little bit. We don't want to get in that position like we do with the state auditors sometime, where you call the main office, they tell you one thing, but when your audit team comes in and looks at it, you get a different story. So we just want to cover all the bases there. But I just wanted to update council on that piece of it to show that staff is moving forward on that. We may have an option there that we can use to maybe get some adjustments based on that scientific data that we've talked about.
Thank you, Doug. It's encouraging for staff to be able to have that option be available to us. Some of the other takeaways that staff had from the July 5th meeting and council's concerns and questions I'd like to just address briefly today. Certainly one of them was a project timeline. I just wanted to reemphasize why we were moving this forward fairly quickly. It's because of the state mandate that was RCW 3670A 135B requires that we review and revise our development regulations to make sure that they're in conformance with our comprehensive plan, which we adopted last June. Every 8 years or thereafter, and we are included in the June 30th, 2016 deadline. So obviously back then you approved a resolution that extended that 1 year. So that's the deadline for the overall project. What I'd like to do is take a high-level approach to what staff was pursuing as far as moving this effort forward. Basically, a lot of the time was spent up until November on low-impact development. As you recall, that was a pretty massive effort back then. So we started engaging in the critical areas pretty much in December of last year. Some of the steps that we took were to look at the background materials that were prepared as part of the last update of the critical areas in 2005. To establish basically the best available science that was used back then, and then also to examine what had occurred in the last 12 years so that we would make sure that this effort was in conformance with best available science. That took a couple of months of staff time to do that. We began our code update and preparation of a draft ordinance that basically took up a period of about 3 or 4 months to pull that together. We also initiated our external review through the State Environmental Policy Act. We also initiated our state agency coordination primarily with Fish and Wildlife and Department of Ecology. And then we also addressed some of the internal consistencies with our comprehensive plan and our shoreline master program. And then finally, basically through the entire 6 months, we did an internal review with staff, Planning Commission. We initiated a meeting back in January and had a series of meetings with the Planning Commission, as well as with the City Council here. I think our first meeting was back in April on this topic. So with that as the timeline, the other issue that staff saw that needed to be readdressed was best available science. Of course, everything that we do as far as critical areas, according to the state, needed to be based on best available science. There was some question on, well, you know, what was the history of best available science? And essentially that came into the planning nomenclature back in 1995 as part of the Regulatory Reform Act. It was a pretty large sweeping piece of legislation that impacted permitting timelines, environmental protection, integrated the growth management planning and the environmental review. So it started back in 1995, and if I recall correctly, it actually took a 3 years before that was actually defined, and it left local jurisdictions in scratching our heads to figure out, well, what exactly meant by the best available science. Well, Department of Ecology's definition of best available science is current scientific information used in the process to designate, protect, or restore critical areas that is derived from a valid scientific process as defined by WACS 195-900 through 925. So that definition really doesn't get into what best available science is, but by reading the WACS, which is pretty extensive, it goes into substantial detail as to what the state law is looking for that qualifies for best available science.
May I interrupt?
Yes, please do.
So just one piece of history and then one comment. Historically, the city was first required to incorporate best available science in our critical areas code with the 2005 update. So that was the first time that we were required to really incorporate that term and that language and that science into our body of regulations. And so as Dennis and others started working on our update this time around, because we had done a pretty substantial work at that point, relatively speaking, we had very few adjustments to make to our code in order to stay consistent with that concept. That's the historical fact. The comment is, while this definition doesn't per se tell you what that means, if you trace it down through the WAC, it's going to tell you what is a valid scientific process and the nature of the qualifications which are necessary for the different disciplines, the fact that it's a peer review process. There's a whole series of things, as you might imagine, that help you define what best available science is. And maybe one more comment, which is maybe appropriate here or elsewhere in the presentation, which is there's best available science which can be made available to us that we can utilize, or jurisdictions have the option to pursue their own best available science. If you choose to do that, then it means that you're going to take the steps which meet this definition and then which meet the scientific process as outlined by that particular WAC. So there's really two ways that you get that body of information, either things which have been already prepared, which are applicable to your area, or you undertake your own independent review and work meeting that definition. Thanks, Dennis.
Yep, thank you. And in fact, following up on that point, Island County is utilizing some scientific information that they prepared for their wetland delineations and buffer requirements. So they are considering that study that was done as their best available science, and they're basing their research on that. One of the other items that came up and was questioned was, well, what happens if we don't adopt the critical areas ordinance update at this point in time? And quite honestly, the first one that comes to mind is that we would be considered non-compliant with GMA, and that could have impacts into any grants or funding that we try to obtain from state agencies. That could be transportation funding, recreation funding, any type of grant opportunities that may be available at the state level. Maybe we can be considered ineligible, or as part of filling out the application, we wouldn't be able to fill in that box that says we're compliant with GMA and lose according number of points, however the rating system is for that type of grant. The other issue that we discussed is if we don't adopt these critical area regulations at this point in time, it adds some uncertainty as to our permitting process, because we would be required to utilize what's in code. And if, for instance, a development was adjacent to a wetland, that wetland buffer would be what we have in code at this point in time. However, at the state level, ecology would not review or would not look at those buffers as meeting their best available science requirement. What repercussions that has for us as a city, I'm not quite sure if the ecology would come back and say, well, no, you know, what their actions would be for that type of development. Steve, I don't know if you want to
You know,
add.
this is really just a sort of a gray area for us. You know, ecology doesn't have a local permit approval role, rather. And under normal circumstances, they do comment on different types of permits, or they comment on SEPA applications, SEPA checklists, and so you know, there's the possibility that we get some comments back in that realm. But these are the two most practical things that we saw as a consequence of not taking action at this time. The second one is a little harder for us to define, but we felt that we should point that out to you, because we would have a unique situation where we'd be applying a code which isn't consistent with the current recommendations.
So again, buffers, wetland, was brought up as a concern in comments. So as Steve mentioned, the 2005 buffers that we have in our code at this point in time were based on the state model ordinance back then, and that was accepted as the best available science. And again, we replicated that process by utilizing Department of Ecology's model ordinance and also the buffers that they have recommended in that document, which they indicate would provide a moderate risk of degrading our wetlands. So that is acceptable according to Department of Ecology. And in fact, the statement that Steve alluded to before about whether we could go out on our own and establish our own wetland buffers, I'd like to read this. This is out of the wetland guidance for critical areas ordinance. It was done by Department of Ecology in 2016. And it says, ecology's buffer recommendations are based on a moderate risk approach to protecting wetland functions. This means that there is a moderate risk that wetland functions will be impacted. Adopting smaller buffers represents a high-risk approach, and you need to be prepared to justify why such an approach is necessary and to offer alternative means of protecting wetland functions that help reduce the risk. So in a sense, what Steve said before, and we'd like to reiterate, is that if we venture away from the DOE recommended buffers, we would have to create our science or some justification that ensures that the wetland functions and values are protected. So, you know, the onus would be on us to ensure that those wetland functions and values would not be degraded by the smaller buffer areas. Graphically, as far as the city is concerned, this is the National Wetlands Inventory. It's a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service wetland mapper is what they call it. It's been in existence for a number of years. I think the service continues to update the mapping. And as you can see, well, obviously the scale isn't the best to see, but you can see the larger complexes of wetlands that influence us. Thank you, Steve. In fact, I will go into more detail for this. This is the 7th Street wetland. And again, keep in mind that with this type of imagery and the National Wetlands Inventory, it's more of a, this is where your wetlands are. It's not a delineation that we can use to improve a development application. We would require an applicant to do a more detailed study and delineation of a wetland, but this gives us a general idea of where these wetlands are. It's good to know that some of these wetlands already have substantial urban development along their delineation, the outside of the wetland areas. So the increased buffers that we are proposing as part of the critical areas would not impact the existing development. As I mentioned, that's the 7th Street wetland complex. The next one is the Crescent Harbor complex, which is basically on federal property. It's the naval property, and we don't have jurisdiction over that wetland complex. Consequently, any buffers that would be placed in our code that would be placed on that wetland really wouldn't affect any new development. I don't think the Navy is planning to do any new development in that vicinity. Another fairly large wetland that we have is the Friends Marsh wetland. And again, like I say, this is a very general representation of what the wetlands are like in this area. I don't believe that the wetlands encompass that entire area. So upon any type of adjacent development, we would get a delineation. So that's a vague description of where the.
Before we leave, I warned Dennis about a potential reaction from the council when we showed this slide. I was expecting.
Moving right along.
I was expecting ridicule and scorn, not outright laughter, but I think this is a great example slide, and if you'll allow me to digress for just a moment.
Sure.
So when you look at this resource and you look at the language that describes it, it's based on 30-year or older aerial photography. A lot of times it's based on USGS soil maps from the 40s or the 50s. And so it really is a macro level sort of look at it, or you could think of the word gross level look. And the key here, and Dennis mentioned it in one of the previous slides, is all this really does is says to somebody, hey, there's the potential for a wetland in a particular area. It's not till we get down to the site-by-site analysis until you figure out where the boundaries actually are. So we know that there are no wetlands underneath the Whidbey Island Bank or over, immediately in the 7-Eleven parking lot. We know that from our local knowledge, but at the national level, gross level mapping, that information just doesn't exist to them. This is old information laid over top of new aerials. And so don't let this sort of concern you or confuse you into saying, oh my gosh, we've got way more wetlands than we think. Again, this is just a foot in the door kind of a thing to say, yes, we know there are wetlands here. We happen to know that this doesn't have wetland characteristics there. We know that there's both naturally occurring and created wetlands in that area because that's our local knowledge. Thanks, Dennis.
And thank you. And just look at some of the other areas of the city. The southwest, there are a few pocket wetlands. And again, there may be, upon growth in the next 20, 25 years, some impacts by these wetlands as far as the wetland buffers are concerned. And then also a few larger wetlands up on the northwest portion of the city. However, the urban growth boundary that Steve was alluding to before actually comes along this line and comes down and then cuts across this way. So it really, they are outside of our current urban growth area boundary. So with that, just want to reiterate that the Planning Commission did forward a recommendation of approval on this package ordinance, and the suggested motion, again, which was in your packet for July 5th, is for approval. But I would be happy to respond to any questions that you might have.
If I may offer just one more comment, one of the points of that particular series of slides with the maps was to not only demonstrate to the council where our existing wetlands are, but also to give you a sense of how often they occur or how often they don't occur within our community. And so sometimes it may be hard when we think about regulations in the abstract. So we're going to talk about how these rules apply to wetlands. Well, if we didn't give you a good sense of how many wetlands we're really talking about, you may think that they apply to much more sets of properties in our community than they actually will when it comes right down to it. That was one of the other goals of showing you that series of slides.
So I hope that addressed some of the concerns that were raised a few weeks ago at our July 5th meeting. So any questions?
So let's, we need to have a public hearing. We do have, I know a couple have joined us from the public, so I'll give, this would be an opportunity for the public to weigh in on the ordinance number 1801. So, okay, seeing none, then we'll bring it back to council and open it up for council. Councilor Munns.
Thank you. So I have spent time reading the WAC 36-19599 anyway. And I understand that we would be taking a risk about being ineligible for some things. But I also read in there that the responsibility for including best science and development of implication of critical area policies or regulations rests with the legislative authority, which would be the council and not the staff.
Absolutely.
So, but it just, I don't know, there just seems like there's a lot of questions when you see SEPA in here and you see the runoff. And I felt pressured to pass the LID when I think it's wrong. I know you have been trying to battle that, but I don't know. Is it, I know when we got a letter about, it's not really related, but kind of, about we were out of ordinance for our gun regulation. There were 9 words. And I remember Bill Hawkins, who was our attorney at that time, saying, you know, if they're going to come after you, they're going to send you a letter. You'll have time to change it if you need to before you really get sued or whatever. And there's a pecking order. Is this maybe the same kind of thing? I mean, it's like we keep passing stuff that doesn't really fit our area. It's causing a lot more unaffordable increases for just having basic housing, affordable housing. And where do you draw the line? Has everyone gotten where they've given up the fight? I mean, I don't want to put us in that predicament, but when we are elected to not necessarily take the safe route, I mean, we're not supposed to be burning flags and doing, you know, but when is enough enough? And so I don't know. I can understand what you're saying, but I also know that it's the elected body who is responsible. So I don't want the staff to feel like you're getting beat up. Let them beat us up. But I just, I'm trying to balance with doing what's right, even though someone else is cramming down my throat saying, oh, what we know is right. Best available science, the Marina, when we did remodeling, you had to have light come through because of best available science. When we asked them what it was, they go, well, we just think this. We're calling it best available science. And so we incurred a lot of extra money because making things so the light shines through, and you never see fish in there unless it's nighttime. They like to go to the shade. So I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time swallowing what. So I don't know. I'm just making a statement, I guess. I'm not sure how I'm going to vote, but I'm making a statement that says, I don't feel this is right. I don't know what to do about it. So I'm looking to my colleagues. I mean, sometimes you just have to make a stand, and maybe this is it, maybe it's not it, but we're trying to provide affordable housing, and we find now we can't get people to come here to even build stuff or work on things because they can make more money in Seattle. I mean, we had trouble with some of our bids for the wastewater treatment plant. Okay, so we're on an island. I'm tired of hearing, well, you're on an island, we don't want to do it. We can't make enough money. I mean, but we still have to provide it for the citizens. So I don't know what this gets me.
So
Council members, help me out here.
maybe a couple of things. As you might
Okay.
imagine, staff spent a lot of time talking about how do we help you after the July 5th meeting, right? It was clear to us that there were some substantial concerns on some of your parts, and we're trying to figure out, well, how do we best help you with those things? It certainly wasn't our intention if somehow we conveyed to you that you had no choices or that this was being shoved down your throat. Yes, there is certainly a path that we could be on, and this is the one that we've been pursuing, which is to utilize the things that Dennis has already talked about. There is this other path, as we talked about briefly today, that we could try to undertake an effort to develop localized science that says, okay, ecology, we get this, we understand what it is you're talking about, but we don't think your model works well for us. We'd have to figure out how to go through that scientific process so that we would have local-based information. Now, that wouldn't change the things we have to do. We still have to protect wetlands, and we still have to protect them according to ecology's regulations, the functions and values. And it's way more complex than all of that, but boiling it down, we wouldn't get away from the requirement to protect them. The question would be, how would we go about that? And so there are two real big doors open for us. One is the one that we have suggested and that we've been working on so far, which is utilizing available guidance. The other door is to develop your own science. And both of those are equally valid. As to the question of timing, if the council has more questions that you think we can help you with, will the world come to an end if we take a couple of more meetings to try to get you that information? We're not going to tell you that. If there are things that you think that we can help answer and it just is a little more time, the world's not going to come to an end if we move this out until September so that we can maybe walk you through some more things or help answer more detailed questions. That's an option as well. So we don't want you to feel pressured. We don't want you to feel like you only have one choice and you're being backed into a corner. There are other ones, but there are ramifications on how we pursue those.
That's just one more question. If we don't approve this today, Dr. Merriman has said that Manual 5, that finding a fact, that we can write something up. But if we issue permits, how does that affect that if this comes back into being passed how it is written today?
So the modification that Dr. Merriman is talking about is the modification which lets us use a different amount of rainfall when we're talking about low impact development and how do we handle stormwater. And at the risk of a slightly different viewpoint than Mr. Almberg has, while LID is embedded into the critical areas, it is just a piece of it. And so the main body, the vast majority of these regulations have nothing to do with low impact development. So the geologically hazardous areas and wetland buffers for that matter really aren't governed by our following the low impact development standards in terms of the rainfall model. So that's going to be a huge benefit to us, hopefully, when it comes to how much stormwater you have to deal with on your property when you develop. It's probably not going to change what our buffer answers are going to be for wetlands.
Okay,
Related but yet separate.
okay, thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem.
I just follow up from Mrs. Munn's little concern, or Mrs. Munn's concern. Will that fall under the SEPA instead of making determination of non-significant? That would be a significant concern, Mrs. Munn.
That is an outstanding question. And the answer is that we are normally allowed to issue a determination of non-significance if we can handle all of the anticipated environmental impacts with our existing body of regulations. So the short answer is no, it probably doesn't eliminate our ability to issue what we refer to as a DNS. We get out of that realm only when there's some kind of impact created by the project that our body of regulations that we're always talking to you about can't address. And then we get into what we refer to as a mitigated determination of non-significance, which means we have to craft some special conditions to handle that impact. So on probably 99 out of 100 development applications, we can do a DNS.
And I have no. Okay,
No,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead and break. That's me.
You're finishing, yeah, no.
Can I continue?
Yes, go ahead.
This is on the, we know that there was a concern about the buffer, increasing buffer, and I think we know that the director has the authority to increase buffer. Now, my question is on the fiscal effect of decision by the city for increasing buffer. To increase the buffer, that will involve taking the land of a property owner. if the land is owned by private ownership. This involves taking of that property involving eminent domain. The city would take, increasing the property.
So, we get into what I'm really thinking you might be referring to, Mr. Begal, is what we would know as a regulatory taking. So, in other words, if the application of our regulations are so onerous as to deprive you as the property owner reasonable economic use of your property, that's what we call a regulatory taking. We work extremely hard to make sure we're never in a position for that. And so that's sort of part one to the answer. Part two of the answer, if you will indulge me, I think can actually be done by looking at one of these maps. So over here on the far left-hand side of the screen, or what would be the west portion of the community, is a wetland that's in the lower corner of the Red Wing development. That's the typical kind of thing that we're dealing with. That was a very low-quality wetland. Under that category at that time, I think it might have been a C or a D, which A being the best, so it gives you an idea that when we talk about its low category, in other words, it has very little functions and values. It's a wetland, yes, but it's not a whiz-bang environmental benefit, right? So here it was, and so as you can see, the Red Wing project was built around it, and we applied the standards at that time. We probably did some buffer width averaging. There may have been some reductions that they would have applied for and qualified for. That's pretty typical in this lower grade quality wetland. That's the kind of example that we are typically dealing with. We have not run across a situation, Mr. Begal, where we've needed to recommend expanding the buffers beyond the size that are in our code already, because that's the kind of example that we're dealing with, is that smaller, low-grade wetland that is not hydrologically connected to any other larger significant wetlands, and has very little functions and values from a habitat perspective.
So right now there's no areas in the wetland around the city that have potential fiscal effect to the city from increased buffer.
No is a strong word. So last time we talked, you heard me say that probably the 7th Avenue wetland is probably the only one which might have some Category 1 functions to it, but it's also a very large wetland system, and it has a fairly well-established development pattern around it for the uses that we probably anticipate. So that's probably the one that has the highest quality, at least inside of the city limits or even inside of the city's urban growth area. The others are not of that quality to the best of our knowledge, which then means that big number that the council was very concerned about from a buffer width perspective, that 300-foot number, that's not the number that would apply in this situation, because that wetland wasn't of the quality that required that large of a buffer. At the time, it probably required a 50-foot buffer, maybe a 75-foot buffer, and again, that we went through the allowed process to make sure that you're protecting the functions and values, but also not to overburden the project. And I think that was our underlying message last month, or at the last meeting, is that there are a number of tools within this code which allow us to try to balance all of those things so that it makes sense for the property, but also makes sense for the environment.
Thank you, Mr. Parker.
Councilor Almberg.
Thank you, Mayor. My first question is, how can we be in non-compliance with GMA when we are working towards resolving some of these issues that we have currently discovered? We have more information now than we had on July the 5th. And why not apply for an extension to let them know what we were doing and the concerns that we have?
Good questions, Mr. Alberg. It's not an automatic flip of the switch that, at midnight you become non-compliant. We've prided ourselves as a community to try to never find ourselves in that position. We've either met our deadlines or we've sought extensions to deadlines in the past. I think how you actually end up in in that role is probably one of two paths. One is if for one reason or another as a jurisdiction, you just refuse to do something. And there are examples of that.
Which we are
throughout-
clearly not doing.
Right, throughout the state. If you refuse to do something, you will be found to be non-compliant. And whether that's because the state agency deems that to happen on their own or because somebody decides that they want to try to compel you to take action. That's kind of how that works. There's the practical aspect of it, which would be, as Dennis said, when we're filling out a grant application. When you know you've met all your deadlines, you get to check the box that says, yes, you're GMA compliant. When you still are working on a piece, even if you have an authorized extension from the state, you still would not be deemed to be compliant because you haven't met that deadline.
So you couldn't have an extension in writing approved and then they consider you not in compliance?
I don't know the specific answer to that, Mr. Almberg. Again, we've never found ourselves in that position. If the real question is, can we ask for an extension because we have some things that we'd like to explore, I think we can make that request. What we were trying to do was, because I think the question was, what are the consequences? And that non-compliance and the practical part of that is, when you apply for a grant to the RCO for a park improvement, they're going to ask you, are you compliant with GMA? If you check no, Dennis tells us you'll lose a couple of points in the overall scoring. Some grants may say you're not eligible at all if you can't check yes. Are we in a position right now where we're going to be doing that? Probably not on the planning side, maybe more on the capital improvement side.
Well, this is a big ticket item, and the reference in our packet regarding the WAC 365, Ms. Munns was correct that the responsibility for implementing criteria for these policies rest with the legislative body of the county and the cities.
We're
And it
aware of
al-
that.
Yeah, and it goes on to say, however, when feasible, counties and cities should consult with qualified scientific experts or a team of qualified scientific experts to identify scientific information determining the best available science as it applies to us. We are doing that now. We are following this guideline. I don't want to put the staff in a position to do DOE's bidding, constantly defend them. I think DOE should defend themselves.
We'd be on board with that.
Yeah, I'm sure you would. But we're following these guidelines, and I would request that the staff apply for a written time extension, so we may not be considered in non-compliance. We may be considered in neutral zone.
And
Not compliant and not non-compliant, okay?
we understand that.
We're
I
in the
get
study,
your
and it
point.
allows us to do that.
I think the question then, really from my perspective, just from a practical nature, is what are we basing the extension on? Is it that we need more time to review the science which is available to us, or are we suggesting that we need more time because we've looked at that and we don't think it fits our circumstances, and so we want to fund our own science, or is there some other thing? I mean, to me, if ecology is going to take the request seriously, we need to give them a rationale for that.
Okay, thank you. And for the rationale, at least for my approach, the rationale is DOE recognizes Eastern Washington rainfall and Eastern Washington stormwater management policies, which are different than the Western Washington model. Clearly, it does.
Yes.
Okay?
Same is true with wetlands, by the way. They have different
Yeah,
guidance on that side of the state.
The science is available, they use it. It should be applied to us also, which it hasn't been applied to us, even though they call it best available science. I would like to delay this until we resolve this issue about LID. That's the burr in my saddle, as you've known for a long time.
think
If
we've
I
known.
had it to do again, I wouldn't have voted for that stormwater LID, but we were told that we had to.
Sure.
And now there is an overlay on this because reference to compliance with current stormwater management, including LID, it says that right in here, is clearly in this critical areas ordinance. It's clearly there. And it also says that all wetlands are part of an aquifer recharge mosaic. And then you go to the LID manual for stormwater. That's the whole reason for capturing the water, so that you do not discharge any water off of your property, even though you still have to put in a catch basin tight line system. So you're doubling up that, but you're capturing the water because the aquifer is critical and the state manages that. So the two are connected.
Sure.
And I don't need to go through this whole discussion on and on, because we've gone through it again. I'm not going to support it until we get the LID issue resolved, and I really appreciate the progress that Dr. Merriman has made with DOE, and the staff is working on this, and that's all I have to say.
Councilor
Thank you. So I'll start off by saying I do appreciate the staff's efforts. I know there's a year's worth of work in there, so when it hits a roadblock, don't think that we don't realize that there's a lot of time put into that. Councilmember Allenberg just made me think of something. You know, we did rescind a community room, so maybe we could rescind our vote on the LID. I too voted for that, and I've often thought, as I've spent more time on it, that maybe that wasn't, I don't know, something, food for thought. We can mull on that one. So I'm going to operate under the assumption that we are compliant until we're deemed non-compliant. So we'll run with that for the moment. And I'm glad that you referenced that Island County had hired someone that was, or they had looked into acquiring their own science. I was reading some papers and doing some research and talking to some folks down there to figure out what they were doing, and their situation is a little different. It's obviously more agriculture rather than urban. So just trying to figure out what our options were. And one of the things in the LID, and I know it's just a small part of this, but are there some possible unintended consequences in that if we try and capture stormwater on the site, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, could there ever be a situation where a retention pond, if we had several lots and they agreed to have a retention pond, could that be deemed a wetland and then preclude further development in that area? Let's say that the retention pond was on the edge of this development, but there's going to be another one next door.
So lots of different scenarios in that question. Probably the easiest way to think about it is the most general way, that in order for something to meet the definition of a wetland, it has to have those three big things that we talked about on the July 5th meeting. It has to obviously have the water component, it has to have actual wetland vegetation, but it has to have the hydric soils. And so
Does it need all three?
it does. Two is not good enough. You got to put a check on all three boxes.
Okay.
And so in a scenario where there may have already been hydric soils and there wasn't already the water, and then maybe you can see where that's going. But so the basic answer is you've got to have all three of those characteristics in order for it to meet the definition of a wetland, which is both the state's definition and the Army Corps of Engineers.
Okay, so I would just want to be careful that, I think your statement, Mr. Lefevre, was this, when we're looking at the 7th Avenue wetland, this doesn't impact existing developments that much, and I would agree with that. My concern is more future development, whether it's, you know, one person trying to develop a house in town or on the edge of town, whatever, is to make sure we're not doing something that's, if the development's already there, it's already there. It's what's happening 10 years from now, 5 years, 20 years from now. So if there was hydric soil, it's the correct term, right?
Right. Yeah.
And we put in a retention pond that starts growing cattails, we have water, we have vegetation, we have hydric soil.
Most of what I think Joe and engineering staff is doing is we're not really, moving towards those retention ponds anyway, right? The whole idea is to get the water into the ground, not to keep it
Right.
there. And I think as you heard through the LID conversations, since soils change so radically, from point to point within a particular site, it's just really hard to predict. As a general rule, the existing rules are pretty unforgiving when it comes to something which was man-made that somehow 20, 30, 40, 50 years later has now taken on the characteristics of a wetland. It is now just a wetland, and that's been that way for quite some time.
Say that one more time. We create something that's created that's man-made, the rules are unforgiving.
They are, in the sense that if it takes on wetland characteristics over time, and it meets all three of those, then it is in fact a wetland. And there are some examples of that we've already dealt with in our community. And that's something that's really embedded in the regulations and nothing that we have control over.
Okay, so then I want to be extra cautious
Sure.
when we talk about expanding buffers to possibly create one of those scenarios. And just follow on thought to that, when we were talking about this last time, you gave the example of, squeezing a balloon, and I appreciate what you're doing there. Can we make the exceptions the rule? If I was coming in and wanted to develop a lot or lots, do we need to have 75%, 50%? Can we just make the exception the rule to take out some of the gray?
The short answer is no. It's very clear from the guidance and the law which applies that we're not able to apply just a uniform reduction that says, wish I had a whiteboard, but Tim would yell at me if I drew on the screen. So here's the wetland.
You could draw on a piece of paper, you could probably zoom into the
Well,
camera.
I'm actually kind of thinking about that. So here's the wetland that we have, and the first thing says you have a uniform buffer, right? That's the easiest way to do this, right? Figure out where the boundary, through scientific methods, you figure out where the boundary of that wetland is, you apply the buffer around it uniformly, you're done, right? And then you develop around it. If that doesn't work, then that's where we start talking about those exceptions or those exemptions, to use your word. And so maybe we're able to now draw this buffer in to the narrowest width which is allowed, but in order for that to happen, we've got to expand it out somewhere else. Assuming that we're not able to apply an actual reduction to it. So there's a reduction sometimes that we can apply, but then there's also the concept of averaging. So if it's a reduction, we actually get to reduce the overall square footage that surrounds that wetland. If we can do that and then do the averaging, what you're doing is you're going to have the same area, whether it's the original or the reduced, but you've just redistributed that area. And the way that you get to do that then is to enhance that buffer. So you'll plant additional vegetation. And then once that buffer is like that, then that becomes the boundary of what we're dealing with when we're talking about development around that. And so that was my example with the Red Wing, right? Once we figured out this, then we knew where you could have lot lines and streets and trails and all of those other kinds of things.
Right. So I want to be responsible, a good steward of the resources. We live on an island in the Pacific Northwest. At the same time, though, that presents a challenge. We're not Phoenix, we're not Houston, we're not Las Vegas that can just go and acquire density and growth. So we've got very limited resources to develop here. So every time we add a regulation or a reduction in developable land, that presents a challenge as well. Go ahead.
Something that may be really helpful there as we talk to the council about this. So here is our piece of property for development, and let's say that piece of property has the capacity to have 25 homes on it. Okay. We start our site development process with you. You learn that you have a wetland down in this corner. That doesn't mean that you lose the lots which are associated by being displaced by that wetland. You still get the same number of lots. That's an automatic thing which is built into our code as well as has its basis in state law. So what it really means is we will allow you, we can allow you to reduce that lot size, that minimum lot size, so that you still get the 25 lots. So you don't get penalized the number of lots because of the presence of the wetland. It just affects how you develop the property.
Got that. However, I'm developing smaller lots that might not be as desirable, therefore not as marketable. And I know we have to, you started off saying this will never change, we have to protect the wetland. So the next question, because we talked about Cherry Hill and the Friend Marsh and some of that mitigation was done. Does it make more sense, or is it possible, rather than increasing, because right now we're talking about increasing buffer sizes, to find an area that we could create true habitat and make a genuine wetland? So rather than have these little pockets of mitigation or whatever they're done throughout different developments, is that what was done with Cherry Hill? Can that developer or person or individual contribute to a bigger play, and actually we create a wetland, a designated area?
Yes, and like much of the conversation that we've had today, as well as on the 5th, it's a scale, it's a gradation, if you will. The first choice is, from the state's perspective, is avoidance, right? That's the word that they use. So you just don't impact the wetland at all, you figure out where it is, you put your buffer around it, great, you develop, and you're good. The next choice is to mitigate your impacts, your proposed impacts to that wetland on site. So maybe the wetlands down here, somehow that doesn't fit with your development goals and your development plans. You say, I can take care of this problem, but it's really going to be better for me over here. And if it works from a science-based perspective, then you can do that mitigation in a different portion of your property. The next choice then is to do it off-site, but on a parcel which is hydrologically connected to this parcel. So it's still part of the same system in some fashion or another. And the absolute last choice is the true off-site mitigation, like we talked about for the Cherry Hill project, which is north of Crosby, and they did their mitigation down by Bayshore. When you do it on-site, the area that you provide will be bigger than the area you're impacting, but relatively speaking smaller. When you go off-site, your obligation then is to build a much larger wetland area than what you were impacting. So it's, again, sort of a sliding scale. If you're going to go off your property, you're going to build more because you're having to provide a higher level of compensation. But that is a choice if you have an appropriate location.
Okay.
Most developers don't go through that because it's fairly complex. Most of them choose to take care of it on their site. Again, most of them aren't large features relative to the overall size of the project.
Okay.
And in often cases, it can become a feature in the project. You know, it's an amenity. The Would-Be Links project out there by the golf course, the landed gentry project next to Fairway Point, that had, by our standards, a fairly large wetland in it. That became a feature in their project, and they developed a walking path through the buffer, which is an allowed thing to do. So it became one of their amenities that they offer to their residents.
Okay. Thank you. So at this point, you know, I too, I'm not ready to support this, and it's not because of a lack of staff effort or too much staff effort. It's really, I want to pursue door number 2 here in, you know, we talked about 20-ish inches a year of rainfall, which is probably somewhat synonymous with Eastern Washington. I'd like to pursue the path of let's let's hire or look into localized, not science, the science doesn't change, the data is what changes, right? Let's take the science and apply it to our data and see if it will give us some options here as far as a little more latitude with some of these regulations. Does that make sense? So obviously, it's not new science, science is science, but let's apply localized data. We know we're in a very unique spot because of the rain shadow, and see if we can use that to work with DOE. That's where I would be at this point.
We understand that method, that approach. I was going to share earlier that when we did the 2005 update to the Critical Areas Code with really the first real shot at having to really include best available science, at that time the state had funding available through the Department of Commerce to help us with those updates. We use our funding to hire environmental specialists to help us review both the state's model and the available data and science in this area, so that's why our standards were as in good a shape as what they are for this update. So we've gone through that before, but we had the advantage of using somebody else's money. To the best of my knowledge, we don't have that advantage right now. And I don't know what that would cost us, but we could certainly try to figure that out.
Councilor Muntz?
Since the county, they're looking at the scientific data a little different because of agriculture, but as long as you have one team hired that is here, if we added some money to it and kind of split the cost, or, I mean, you know what I mean? Some of what they're gathering will be helpful to us, some of it will not be. We'll have some other questions, but if we partner with them somehow, I don't know if it's 30-70, 60-40, whatever, 50-50, it would save us some since we don't have grant money available, but at least, it's better than sending them home and then having to pay for their travel to come back again and whatever else. I don't know what all's involved, but
We'd be happy to
it
look into
seems
that.
like that would be a solution.
We actually did it with
to
the shoreline management plan. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but they hired science to do work for their shorelines all around the island. And as we were updating our SMP, you might remember that effort 4 years ago now, big effort. We hired their guys with the money that we got from the state to take advantage of that work that they'd already done and then applied it to the Oak Harbor shoreline. So we have kind of a history already of doing that.
Councilor Owen?
Thank you, Mayor. I support that concept proposed by Ms. Munns. I would also support dipping into our stabilization fund to help fund this, because I realize that the staff time is a very limited resource and time is of the essence here. I think we have to go outside, and the stabilization fund is there for emergencies. This council member believes that this issue is an emergency, and it's incumbent upon us to help protect the affordability of housing plus the management use of our property in a proper way. I'll make a motion if we have to do that.
I'll add on that one. We have to have a conversation about our stabilization fund as it is anyway, and how we would do that. But we'll write that down as one of the funding sources to consider.
Okay.
And absent anything else, that might be something we come back to and say, hey, why don't we take a look at that?
And then another question I have is, we just take no action on this, or we take action to defer it and to allow staff to have sufficient time to continue to work with DOE and come up with a plan regarding our rainfall LID issues? What is the best way for staff to proceed with this?
And I can, tell me if I'm wrong, if I say this wrong. One of the things we don't want to do is take a negative action.
Yeah.
So it's best just to not take action.
Okay.
You might want to have something though where council, maybe you get some direct staff to continue working on this. We'll bring this back or something.
And we do have an open public hearing.
True.
And so we've got to deal with that technicality. Probably the best thing is just to pick a date certain in the future, continue it to that date, and then we use that as an opportunity to report back to you on our progress and following up on this conversation. Would that work?
That works.
I would skip over August in its entirety and frankly choose the first meeting or second meeting in September, which I don't know what those dates are.
5th and 19th.
Okay.
I would push for October. I want to get results.
Robert, I'm used to crunching the calendar for
I
you.
know.
We can always pick a date, and if we are prepared earlier, we could always bring that
Yeah.
in and have that conversation.
Use the
I'd say second meeting in September or something.
So that's the 19th?
19th.
Just throw a dart at it.
Yeah, and so if we could just have a, Mayor, a motion to continue to that date, that would work.
Councilor Munns?
I move that we continue the discussion on ordinance number 1801 to the September 19th meeting, including the public comment period.
Second.
Okay, motion made to extend the hearing on the ordinance number 1801 to September 19th. Motion by Munn, second by Servadius. Any other, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay,
Mayor, can we take 5?
take 5? Yes. Take a 5-minute break.
You,
We'll reconvene at 3:30.
council meeting just off the top of your Celine's wrapping up, so she can get.
Oh, because I had it with me.
Okay, I'd like to reconvene this afternoon special workshop meeting, July 26th. I'd like to bring your attention to the fact that we are right on time for our development services 3:30 Marina Improvement Plan discussion. We have now at the head table, we have our Development Services Director, Steve Powers, and our Harbor Master, Chris Sublett. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Council. Today I'm going to present to you a proposed marina improvement plan for the years 2018 through 2022. This is hopefully something that you'll see on a City Council meeting agenda in the near future. So a marina improvement plan is a requirement under Oak Harbor Municipal Code Section 2.38.050. It simply states that we should have a 5-year marina improvement plan which shall list all the projects necessary for the safe and efficient operation of the marina over the subsequent 5-year period. As we looked at projects, there's actually a criteria that we needed to follow, and that criteria is that the project must cost $50,000 or more, must be an expense of public funds, it's not annual maintenance or operational expense, it has a life expectancy of about 20 years or more, and it's a large, significant project. We looked around the marina and we found that there were a lot of projects to work on, but we found projects that were kind of a combination of projects that redesign the marina to generate more revenue. We decided that improving the launch ramp angle would be a great idea. We looked at the shoreline and thought there was some opportunity to enhance the shoreline and aid in fish restoration, and we wanted to control the stormwater runoff. So specifically, the projects that we looked at were to remove the entire D-dock roof, and I've got a map I'll show you of this, and reconfigure the east side to remove the fingers in the pile to make that 500 feet of side tie to accommodate the larger boats. That area of D-dock is one of our lowest vacancy areas, or highest vacancy areas. The estimated cost of that is about $1 million. We'd also remove half of the E-dock roof to accommodate more sailboats. We looked at the storm drain, and we'd remove about 700 feet of storm drain and replace it with a natural filtration system. Currently, the water runs off the parking lot through the storm drain and right into the bay, and we estimate that to be about $1.2 million. And then the ramp, the boat ramp, is a very shallow ramp. Most ramps are at about 15%. Our boat ramp is at about 6%. It was made for seaplanes, so we'd like to increase the angle of that. And we think that's about $1 million project. So as you look at the map, you can see the upper small bubble, that's the E-dock section. The dark area is where the covered moorage is. We'd remove about half of those roof structures, which would enable us to bring sailboats in. The 32-foot category, where those covered slips are, is one of our more popular categories, and we continually have waiting lists, but we can't accommodate them with the roof there. The larger bubble in the middle is D-dock, and you could see that we would remove all of the covered roof in that area, the dark area, and then we'd remove all of the fingers on the east side, which is the side closest to C-dock, in the pile there, which would give us a little over 500 feet of side tie where we could accommodate more boats of larger size. The bubble to the left shows you where the boat ramp is, and we'd like to increase that angle there. And then the big circle at the bottom just highlights where the storm drain is and where we would make those changes. So funding sources. We looked at how the marina could fund these changes, and we found that grants are the best way for us. We do have some marina reserves, but they're small. They're not very much. So grants are what we've applied for. We've applied for a grant with the ILIO, which is the Island Local Integrating Organization. They receive state and federal funding. And the interesting thing about them is they may not require a match for us. We've actually got 3 grants out with them currently right now, and they're an environmental agency, so each one of these changes has an environmental aspect to it, along with an aspect that'll help the marina. We've also explored RCO grants. They do require a 25% match, but given the marina reserves and financial status right now, we have not applied for any of those. Because of the cost of these projects, we wouldn't be able to make that 25% reserve. So what does the marina have financially? Just a reminder, we are an enterprise fund. We rely solely on what we generate at the marina to finance the marina. We have 3 months of operating expense. We have a bond reserve, which must stay in place until the bond is finished paying for. We have the equipment rental reserve, which would pay for a new truck, new boat, something like that. And then the capital improvements, and that's really the one that we could leverage off of to pay for some of these bigger projects listed within the Marina Improvement Plan. As you can see, there's very little money in there, about $35,000. As we looked at the projects for the Marina Improvement Plan, we found other projects that we didn't want to fall off the radar. So we added some projects into the Marina Improvement Plan as just an add-on in subsequent tables at the end of it, just so we didn't lose track of them. Those projects were identified by both the Marina, or the staff, city staff, and the Marina Advisory Committee. These projects don't really meet the marina improvement criteria. Funding source is not identified, and some are not under $50,000, or some are under $50,000. The first list of projects is over $50,000, but we don't have the funding to complete them right now, and they're not scheduled. Those projects are like purchasing a new boat hoist hauling system, dredging, maybe a new restroom and office facility. The second list of projects at the end of the Marina Improvement Plan are under $50,000, and they're going to be funded from the reserves of the operating budget. They're ongoing type projects like replacing power pedestals, electrical meters, and replacing whalers, things of that nature. So, with that, I'll answer any questions that you may have.
Okay. Council, questions? Yes, Councilor
You said
Survey.
the showers, restrooms and showers, except the small ones right there underneath your office.
Mm-hmm.
Are there other ones over?
There are other ones at the end of Building 2,
Okay.
next to the laundry room.
So would those be improved, or are you talking about the ones in the current?
We're talking about a new facility somewhere on the property.
Okay.
Yeah.
Councilor Lumber.
Thank you, Mayor. With respect to the reserves, the budget, et cetera, and we've had this conversation in your office too. I'm a little bit surprised that it seems like a complicated formula of applying overhead to the Marina Enterprise Fund. I understand the spreading of overhead costs relative to our other enterprise funds. I understand the concept. The part that doesn't connect with me is the other enterprise funds, for example, sewer, does not share the sewer facility with other community functions. The marina shares the land, the boat ramp, other parts of it as a park function. So why is this formula so convoluted that we are applying an overhead solely paid for by the ratepayers who have boats moored down there when it's really also a park use? Both access to the marina for fishing and other recreational things, access to the ramp, access to utility services, access to the park.
So just to clarify, you're asking,
Why are we applying so much overhead to the marina to be paid for solely by the ratepayers rather than a formula that takes into consideration other uses at the marina area?
sure. I think that's a question that our finance director would answer best.
The indirect cost allocation is based on drivers, different drivers, so I can't tell you exactly what drivers we're applying to the marina at this point, but I can look into that and get back to you.
I would like to understand the formula for doing that. As I intuitively, I think it would affect the bottom line, especially on the reserve.
Yes.
So another part of that answer, I think, Mr. Alberg, could be that since the features that you're talking about are generally perceived as general fund uses, the council could choose to offset, basically help subsidize that. So you'd still make the same indirect cost allocation, but if the council directed general fund dollars to the utility fund, to the marina, you could offset that impact. And then in keeping it in line with the idea that park uses are general fund uses and the utility.
And I understand that concept.
Yeah.
But I would like to have hard numbers, the data that says this is how we're doing it and this is why. So if it's a park use, there should be a general fund park use compensation to that. It's about equitability. Okay?
Can I just make one final comment? The indirect cost allocation was set up so it does have drivers to try to make it equitable. Doug is the one that created that, so yeah, we can get back to you with how that works, but it isn't a random number that's just assigned. It is a driver-driven spreadsheet that takes different factors into effect to make that.
Okay. And then as we go forward, looking at increasing the angle of the slope of the ramp, that is a general public use. It's a recreational use for the general public.
Sure.
It's not necessarily, in fact, limited use by marina tenants. They're already inboard water storage that they're paying for. So why wouldn't the ramp be paid for through a non-marina funding source?
One of the interesting things about the ramp and increasing the angle in that whole project, funding through the ILIO, they are an environmental agency. So it's an add-on piece to controlling stormwater and runoff and pollution in the water. So when we talk to them about things that are contributing to pollution in the water, the ramp was a big one because people back their trucks down there, they get the asbestos, the copper, the exhaust into the water. The ILIO currently is looking into how we can change that. The budget just got passed with the state, so hopefully we'll hear some information on that. But when we originally talked to them, there wasn't a matching dollar, so it wouldn't be marina dollars put in there, it's state and federal dollars put into that change.
They're very excited about that project because to us it obviously helps with how the ramp operates, but to them it helps eliminate a large contributor to water pollution. And so in that case, we've got
So
that.
we are making progress.
And we've got that sort of scheduled out, if you will, as a grant project and not as a marina dollars project.
Okay, and the other question that's related to the use of that ramp is there's a significant amount of commercial use of the ramp. That's non-recreational. Why is that a service provided for free?
As you look at the commercial users of the ramp, traditionally commercial crabbers, one of the things that we notice is we look at that is that those people actually buy moorage at the marina. They actually buy fuel at the marina. When you look at the commercial crab season that historically goes October through January, there's been a few years we didn't have that crab season or it was shortened. And you looked at the revenue from moorage and you looked at the revenue from fuel sales, there was a huge drop off when we didn't have it, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's kind of a misconception out there that they may be using it for free when in fact they are paying for the use of it through their mortgage.
And I recall you did share that information with me at your office about that pattern.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can I add one? I just had a family member come out of surgery, so I had to go check and make sure they're doing okay. So I missed the first part of that conversation there. But one of the things we're doing as well from the advocacy side is we're working with the state right now on, you know how we've done the direct capital grant program for the wastewater treatment plant. I've been working with two of our legislative groups right now to see if we can do a direct capital grant for the ramp itself, and there are a couple other items down at the marina we've had an interest in, to see if we can lump those together as the in and out process of putting boats into the water and doing that. So there's a couple different angles and a couple different funding sources we're working on doing that. It's gonna have to fit, I don't know if you guys talked about, but the funding cycle and going into the next legislative session and how we get that accomplished. But that would give us some opportunities there where we can maybe accomplish those capital projects, but it's not gonna be a charge to the tenants or others that would be impacted by that.
I have a question. Is there a concern about dredging outside of the marina? And I know that's not I think it's our tenant's concern going around the point. I understand that there possibly will need to be dredging in that area.
Yes, the channel is definitely silting in. I'm not sure the last time it was dredged, truthfully. It's been well over 20 years as far as I can tell. That is controlled by the Army Corps of Engineers. At a low tide, and specifically in the summer, unfortunately, is when we have our lowest tides. You may have noticed that there's 2 points that come together. At our lowest tides, when you come through the deepest part of that channel, at times there's only 5 or 6 feet of water, which some sailboats can't get through. That's true. Yes. I know that past harbor masters have worked with the Army Corps of Engineers and tried to get them to dredge that, and have failed at that. It's something that's high on my radar, but I haven't had a chance to approach that yet.
The primary impediment to that, Mayor, as you probably know, is that we don't have commercial maritime operations, which is where the Corps typically functions, or focuses rather, their dredging operations.
So what about the crabbing though? The commercial crabbing doesn't...
It's not enough to carry the day, because it's not a permanently established, you know, we're not a working pier kind of a thing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Just, it gets pretty active at times.
Yeah.
I've noticed down there, so...
It might be something that the only way we can really make any movement in there is work more at the federal elected official level, and try to influence things from that direction.
It just, I just have been told and have experienced that crabbing has, especially out of the Oak Harbor Marina, has become not only for commercial but also tribal, a very active and attractive area for those 2 organizations. So
Maybe we could make a stronger case.
yeah, I would hope so. Okay, any other questions or input about Marina Improvement Plan? Okay, thank you, Chris. Appreciate it. We'll move on to temporary sign code amendment, second briefing.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council. Just wanted to talk today to you briefly about what's happening with moving forward with our temporary sign code. You have my staff report in front of you. I'm not going to sit here and read that. I did want to make a point, though, that there was an open house that took place on April 6th that we got some comments from the public on. And some of those comments I'm going to incorporate into my little discussion here today, so I just wanted to kind of point that out. The key points that we have for the new sign code, number one here is this is not a complete overhaul of the temporary sign code. Staff intends for the numbers, sizes, and locations of the signs to be largely the same as what we had in the past. And this is kind of based on the idea that there's nothing fundamentally wrong with what our sign code says now. We just want to change how we express the information in it. And also because of the Reed versus Gilbert decision, we need to bring this into compliance with that Supreme Court case. So we need to strip away those references to content on how these are regulated. So I just wanted to make that point first off. Through our workshop and through community outreach, planning commission meetings, etc., it appears that the consensus is that there's not, like I said, a fundamental issue here. We don't feel like we have too many signs or not enough signs or complaints about the number of signs that are allowed or complaints that there are too many signs. So that's something that we're kind of operating under, and if there's any change to that, we need to know about it so we can work with that. The beauty, I think, of the way we have this sign code set up is that it's easy to change things. And so if we went through and decided that we want to add, the number of A-frame signs on Pioneer Way, for example, it's an easy change. We can go through and just make a change to a number if we need to do that. So that's one of the things about this code I think that is really beneficial, is its flexibility. So as we move forward, we're going to be continuing our community outreach with the Chamber of Commerce, with the Main Street Committee, and make sure that our interpretation, the overall feeling of the community is correct, that they're okay with the number of signs and there aren't concerns about that particular issue. And so moving on to the concept of the sign code itself, this form-based sign code is based on the idea of form-based zoning, and as far as we know, it's a fairly unique idea. I went to what they called a boot camp regarding some of the sign code issues after that Supreme Court decision that the Planning Organization or Planning Association of Washington put on last month. The city of Sammamish has adopted a similar but more simplified kind of way of doing it. They have 3 different sign types. They have a chart. It's very simplified. To me, it's almost as if they've cut too much out of it. They took they stripped all the content information out, but they, to me, in my mind, took too much out. I think the beauty, again, of ours is it allows for different sign types, and it allows for those different sign types to be allowed in different areas and in different ways. And I think that's a better way of going about it, but that's just my opinion. So we feel that the way that we have the sign code organized now, or proposed to be organized, is it'll make it easier for not only the public but city employees to enforce and to explain to people. I wanted to emphasize also that most all of current signs are going to fit within one of these categories. And I think it's important to note that there was some concern brought up about the 2 different types of A-frame signs. And well, if you're going to allow X number of small A-frame signs, why don't you allow X number of large A-frame signs? Well, these sizes are all maximums. So it's not saying that your A-frame sign has to be this size to be considered this type of A-frame sign. It's everything up to that point. And again, I think that speaks to the flexibility of the way that it's written, is that you can have a tiny A-frame sign if you want, and that will count towards your small A-frame sign. But it also, if you were in an area that doesn't allow for small A-frame signs, but allows for large A-frame signs, it counts in the same way. So I think that allows for a little flexibility there. Again, I just wanted to bring up, we're working with the community groups and business owners to ensure that there aren't significant substantive changes that are going to affect business owners or residents, real estate agents, businesses along the highway, business along Pioneer Way. We want to make sure that everything is fair and is working the way it's intended. And so one of the things that I'm going to be doing over the next month before we get to the City Council adoption or proposed adoption of this code is to make sure that everybody's happy with it, essentially, and make sure that we're not dealing with a situation where somebody feels like they're being treated unfairly. So that's going to be something that I'll be working on in the next few weeks. And then also during that time, we're working on kind of fine-tuning anything that might be missing or might be creating some issues. There is a possibility of adding new sign types. Again, with this matrix, we can add a new sign type. It's just a new column. It's easy. The only thing that I can think of right now are the tube dudes and inflatables, the things that blow in the air and have the arms going around. Whether or not that's something we want to have, I leave to you, but it is something that's not easily categorized in our existing categories, so that was something I kind of put in as a note that we can have in there. And some of the things, again, when you add in a new sign type like that, we can state, for instance, if we want to allow tube dudes, that they have to be within 10 feet of a building. And the reasoning behind that is so that when you plug the thing in, the blower, it's not tripping people. It also makes it so that it's not right out by the road. If we want to have it from an aesthetic standpoint of limiting that, you can do it that way. And again, that's regulating it entirely by the design of the sign and not by its content. So it meets that criteria that are set forth in the Supreme Court decision. And then also the possibility of adding a category for quote-unquote informal signs. During this boot camp that I attended, there was some discussion about how do you regulate people who want to just have a garage sale sign, a quote informal sign. And again, because we can't regulate it by saying garage sale signs, that maybe we have a special category for signs that are maybe up for 2 or 3 days on a street corner in a neighborhood or something like that. So that's something to consider as well. And then finally, I think the most, or the least consensus I think that we found when we talked to the Planning Commission and had our public open house was the possibility of having sign permits for temporary signs and charging money for that. And the reasoning behind that is to try and be able to actually say that, you know, your sign has been up for X number of days, it needs to come down. Either there's a sticker on the back that says that, or there's a permit tracking system. You know, the upshot of that is, you know, we can make sure to get those signs down when they need to be down, so they're not just sitting there forever. The issue is that is going to require some staff time for sure to go through and administer that. So that's something that we need to consider, maybe discuss at the future meeting. It's not included currently, and I think that that's kind of the way that staff has determined that we would prefer it. But again, that's one of those discussion items. So again, I have the copy of the proposed sign code in front of you here. If there are any questions or if people have any concerns or additions, subtractions, etc., I'm definitely here for those comments, and then we'll plan on moving forward into August. We got notice for the August meeting to have a public hearing on the sign code to determine if we want to adopt that at that time or not. So I'm available for questions if you have any.
Well, Ray, I apologize for not introducing you, but our city planner
All
took
right,
off so
yeah.
fast there.
Sorry.
We know you're usually down doing the heavy lifting downstairs, so thank you for coming. Nice presentation.
Thank
here.
you.
So let's open it up to council. Any questions at this point? Yes, Councilor Servatius.
One for me on the small A-frames. Some of these, the more permanent ones, permanent temporaries, you reference maintain and good repair. There's some A-frame signs out there that look good, and there are some A-frame signs out there that don't. And I know that's subjective to try and enforce. Is there anything we could put in there that, I mean, there's some tired, beat up A-frames that just get stuck out there, and I don't know, like I say, it's a subjective call. What's in good repair, and maybe it's in the eye of the beholder, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, and the general standards in the very first section there talks about being in a state of disrepair, including falling down, being defaced, tattered, torn, or broken, or excessively faded to the point of illegibility. Again, that's still subjective. I think it's a little bit more specific, but if there's additional language or, you know, definition of what tattered is or something along those lines, we can certainly add that in.
I'll read through that. And then I think we've touched on this, but as far as once again the A-frames place, public rights of way, 1 per frontage. So I'm not picking on Pioneer Way, but I'm thinking of Pioneer Way.
Sure.
They just put them out on the sidewalk. And what determines where they go? Is that in here and I've missed it in the text, or?
It's, yeah, and that essentially a frontage refers to a parcel or a lot. And so if you have a lot that fronts onto Pioneer Way, they're generally going to be limited to 1 per lot. That brings up issues if you have ones, for example, at the Old Town Mall there, where they might want to have 2 or 3 there.
Right.
So that's going to be one of those that we're going to have to kind of figure out. If we want to allow for more in certain locations, we can do that too. Again, because we're not limiting them based on their message. We can say, you know, in certain areas of the city, we can allow for more, and maybe that's one of those places that we do that.
So businesses that have one that say 1 block over or 2 blocks that way, that's not really frontage. We probably.
Well, and that's, yeah, and
Right.
that, again, that's because of the message. And if they have something that's, for instance, you know, there's some up here on Barrington.
Right.
And we can't limit them because they say that our business is down on Pioneer. We're just saying that there can only be 1 sign there. And so maybe what that does is it makes it so that, you know, somebody has to run up the hill first thing in the morning to get their sign there before somebody else does. And
So one per frontage, not necessarily, that's a lot, not their lot. That's where I was going, I guess.
a lot,
Yeah.
because we can't restrict it by the message, by the content of the sign. So we
Right,
can't
but-
say,
But can we say it has to be in front of basically it has to be in front of your business, the lot where your business is located, not
we
wherever.
could say that, but how do we enforce it? Because we don't know whose sign it is unless we read the content of it.
But
That's
if I
the
was
problem.
entrepreneurial and I wanted to say patronize Joel's place, I could run all over town in the public rights of way and just stick up A-frames, could I not?
So the challenge with that, and we've talked a lot about this at the planning commission, is that would work really well in a commercial circumstance. We can say just one per business per parcel that the business is located on. Where it gets challenging then is when we start wanting to talk about those signs which our civic organizations put up. And so for them to have the one on the parcel where they're having the car show doesn't really do them much good, right? So we had feedback, well, we want to be able to place our temporary A-frame sign on the north end of town or somewhere else because that's what directs people to our event. And so under our existing code, we treated commercial signs in one fashion and civic organization signs in another fashion. And that's the flaw from the constitutionality perspective. And so we struggled with this quite a bit, as did the Planning Commission. But that is a path that's available to you. You could say one per use per parcel, something like that. Because that would be a manner in which that sign is being placed. But it would probably eliminate our ability to have those other types of temporary signs which have supported other types of things in our community.
So is a distinction then in the time column for the small A-frames? Time column, weekend events, 3-day events, non-recurring events. Could that have more latitude than a business that's traditionally operating 5 days a week?
I believe it could. That might be something we'd have to discuss from a legal standpoint.
Because they appreciate whether it's a car show, boat show, gun show, you see those signs, and that's fair. They got to broadcast it's happening. What I'm looking at, and you pointed out Barrington, so there's a collection of signs that never move. I don't think there's 3 or 4 stacked in a row, but those just get put out there and sometimes around town, and they're just left out.
And that's kind of a policy choice that Ray was referring to earlier, or one of the many policy choices in this particular project, is does the council want to see that kind of activity to continue to be allowed? If so, we can craft regulation in order to make that work. Or do you think that's not consistent with our community standards? And you shouldn't be allowed to place a temporary sign for your permanent business on somebody else's property. That's a policy choice that you can make, and we can craft regulations that implement that policy choice. Where it gets rough for us is when we have one foot on either side of the fence.
Sure. For me personally, I'll yield the floor here, is I'd like to see less, neater, and they correspond to the business or in close proximity to the business, with the exception of the event. I'm going to call them event signs, however you want to categorize that with time. But
Ding, 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 ding. Somebody's twitching over here.
it's not content.
It is.
It is content.
Yeah.
Because of so let's call it temporary timeline.
If you have to look at the
Non-
sign in order to determine whether or not it violates your regulation, if you have to look at what the sign says in order to determine whether or not it violates your regulation, then you're regulating based on content.
So I would try and regulate based on the recurring or the occurrence of the event.
Which is in line with time, place, and manner, which are
Right.
the things that we can do.
And the other thing that we can do as well is we can, if they're applying for, say, a temporary use permit, we can include a sign component with that. And that's something that was discussed at the boot camp that I went to, is how they can do that, because you're tying it into the event permit and not a sign permit.
Right. So there's clearly favored corners in town, that people try and, there's multiple signs
Sure.
packed together, and it's just, I don't know, it's effective really as far as the messaging, 'cause sometimes they're hard to see, they're so close together, and it certainly isn't attractive from a, visual standpoint,
Right.
passing by.
Yes.
This question for Nikki is, what about campaign signs? I mean, that truly, RCW has rules about that, about when they can go up and when they have to be down and what has to be on them and stuff. And if the Supreme Court says this, then I'm sorry, then you wipe out all the campaign signs or else they're not counted. They could be up year round. So I'm just throwing that out to you because.
That is addressed in Ray's draft.
The thing is that, again, we're regulating by the sign type. So typical campaign signs are either, the ones you kind of stick in the ground, they're about this big, or they're your big 4x8 sheets. And those are all addressed in here, and the number of each of those that you can have are addressed in here. And so I think we're covered from that standpoint. The RCWs can talk about timing and stuff, and they can feel free to do that. Ours, are the way they are. So I think that constitutionally we're protected from that standpoint. If the RCW wants to be more specific about timing and stuff like that, then we'll let the state enforce those rules.
Anyone else? I think it's really good, the outreach that you've done to work with the chamber and the other organizations that you've worked with. Thank you for doing that.
Yep.
And I think that no more questions. Okay. Thank you,
Thank
Ray.
you.
Appreciate it. Our final under development services is item number C, Arts Commission update.
Yes, CAC would normally present this item, but he's not able to be here this afternoon. He's at a different meeting. Essentially, what we'll be bringing forward at the August 15th meeting is a little code amendment for the council to consider to move the membership number for the Arts Commission from 9 down to 7, which is more reflective of our existing other bodies that advise you, and also probably a little more effective in terms of group management size and reflective of the existing conditions that we have. So kind of a little housekeeping amendment. We'll bring that forward in 3 weeks or so and seek your approval of it.
Okay, any questions or thoughts, inputs? Okay. Well, it says under 430, it says City Council, so I'm wondering if there's any other business that anyone has here. Councilor Servadius.
Do we have any kind of a whiteboard or tablet in the technology world that if we needed to present, that Surface Pro, can you beam what the person's drawing to?
We went paperless and went all technology, so.
Surface Pro.
I already seen Nicole over there.
Wants to buy something.
We'll probably figure something out.
Yeah.
Schedule that on the meeting where we rescind the lid, no.
That's Tim.
Keep shaking his head, yeah. Thank you, Mayor.
You've got the staff thinking, I can tell. Anything else? Yes.
Just one thing to add along that line. Nicole, Tim, and others have been working on a change in our videography. We had a little issue with some equipment and some smoke and visitors from the firefighters here not too long ago, and we were coming down to actually, do we replace this equipment? Kind of got everybody together, and we're actually on YouTube. And so we have our own station on there, and we're doing that. There's some differences that we're using, some software and some other mechanics. If you go on and watch our videos now, you'll see they're much clearer. And things are working a lot better, and we actually now, where you'd see somebody talking, Nicole just told me about this today, you'd see him talking and it would switch to just the screen, or what the PowerPoint was. Now where they talk, there's a corner that pops up and you can actually see the person talking and the screen at the same time. So there's some new things we're doing that way on technology side that I think will get our information and our stuff out there a lot better. So go on and check it out, and you'll see those things on there. It looks a lot better than we were doing before.
Still a link through the city's homepage to videos, is that how they find them?
Do you know Nicole?
Yes, so currently you will be able to go to our website and we'll take you directly to the city's YouTube channel. As you can see right in front of me, we are streaming live currently. We wanted to test it out to make sure it works. It'll be annotated as normal. By taking this proactive step, we've been able to eliminate a portion of the live stream budget. This is something that is free, and also it will notify you on your mobile telephone, so I can watch live stream YouTube on my phone if I'm riding the bus. It will also notify me anytime you guys go live, so if I want to watch, I can tap in, and actually Councilmember Heisen is currently watching us live stream currently.
So good stuff.
Yep. Okay, no further business. We are adjourned.